Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and I intended this week to make my first set of videos where the full, unaltered version of what I'm going to say would show up on Ramble and on the Shoot of Bit, and I would put a sort of notification video on the Tube of You. But, regrettably, I fell ill. You can probably tell from my voice if you listen to earlier videos. So I shan't be doing that. This, and one other, will be the only video that I make this week. Although I do have a video that is older than this, well, really 3 videos that are older, that I shall also be releasing. Nevertheless, I shall talk a bit about the quiet revival, which I predicted would happen years ago. For some bizarre reason, people, when the new atheism started, accepted this narrative that while secularism in the modern world was given birth to during the Enlightenment, which broke the back of religion, making it incapable of holding its strength, and while the scientific progress of the 19th century further destroyed any hope of religion recovering, people nonetheless remained strongly religious, with very little dip, until finally the voice of reason cut through the madness and darkness of religion, shining a light of truth upon the world, bringing us reason through logic and critical thinking and fact-based thinking, knowing that only empirical evidence was true evidence, finally dispelling religion with its knockdown, destroying religion with facts and logic and reason above all things. Finally, the new atheists had reached mass appeal and a mass audience, and through them, finally, people realized religion was insane, irrational nonsense that brings nothing but evil into the world. They dismantled even the very foundations of religion. And finally, no more religion could stand, and the world belonged to the secular, not the religious, who embraced reason and science, not myth and fairy tale. The narrative was that religion was dead or dying, and it bore out for a long time. Religiosity declined throughout the Western world. Even in America, we saw fewer and fewer people being religious and more people being nons. We saw reason through secularism rising as more and more people said they were not religious and embraced a more progressive social order. It was assumed that this trend would see the death of religion, or at least the death of the biggest, most prominent religion in the West, Christianity, a religion based on lies and falsehood and hate that had poisoned society and brought nothing but misery and enslaved us. In fact, the reason we had slavery in the West was because the Bible, the very book Christianity is based on, approved of slavery, calling it good. It was atheists, agnostics, and deists who fought hard during the Enlightenment to destroy it, only for latecomer Christians to join the movement and then take all the credit. But really, the Bible and Christianity caused slavery. No evil can be laid, of course, at the feet of atheism. Some people tried. Religious people lied through their teeth about the Soviet Union and communism being atheistic. It wasn't, though. Communism is actually a form of religion. And it was religious thinking, not atheism, that caused it. And as Dawkins and Harrison Dennett and Hitchens brilliantly pointed out, the communists killed in the name of communism, not atheism. But now atheism speaks. Reason prevails. And secularism, not religion, will be the rule of the day. And for a long time, this narrative worked. The narrative worked. And fewer people were religious. People were announcing their faith. They were, as they put it, deconverting from religion, embracing reason to atheism. And this is especially a trend of the young, so that most remaining religious people were older, and they would die out, and the few remaining young people who were religious would deconvert, and eventually, even though a few might hold on, they would eventually too vanish. And 3 or 4 generations from now, people will look back wondering why religion held on for so long, why people were so delusional. And now, we have come to the turning of the tide. For you see, now we talk about the quiet revival in the UK. And we see a revival in the US. And we see revivals even in France and a few other countries. Church attendance is increasing. And while it is still the early stages and it is still young, atheism is slipping. People aren't interested in what the atheists say. And there's all sorts of reasons for why this is true. Like, there's only so many ways you can prove that God doesn't exist. Only so many ways you can show that it is irrational to believe in God. Only so many ways you can prove that the idea of God is incoherent. Only so many ways you can show that religion doesn't make sense, that the Bible is rubbish, and that Christian morals are garbage. There's only so many ways. There's only so much to talk about. But really, that's not the truth. You see, the real death knell of secularism is that it is a lie. And the entire narrative that I just told you, and it'll be one that I'll repeat in a future video when I feel better, but the entire narrative is a lie. Even deconversion from religion to atheism is a lie. Even the idea that secularism is not religion is a lie. And I don't think that many people quite apprehend that concept quite yet. They at least can't articulate it. But it is fairly obvious that the skeptic community, that named itself the skeptic community, by the way, was doing the very things that religion did, that it claimed was wrong in religion. Like the idea that religion promotes tribalism. It's one of the great evils of religion. It promotes tribalism. Well, secularism was supposed to free us from tribalism, but it didn't. Instead, you had the secular tribe and the religious tribe. And the secular tribe was supposed to free us from group fighting and infighting. Oh, certainly there was fighting with the religious because they simply wouldn't embrace reason. But amongst secularists, we were supposed to see a situation where even if 2 people who were atheists firmly disagreed with each other, they would be willing to sit at a table and talk out their differences and arrive at a rationally coherent conclusion. One may even change their mind or they'd arrive at a compromise. But no matter how deeply rooted their beliefs were, they would realize they were fallible men and they would be willing to change their mind with evidence. They would be willing to talk it out. Not so with the religious. Religious people think every issue they hold is a mandate from God and has cosmic significance. Therefore, they change no opinions. Thus, there is no compromise and no negotiation. This is why religion is wrong, because there are so many religions out there that disagree. And rationalists who aren't religious, who just base their ideas on the facts that contradict religious dogma, who will naturally come into conflict. Indeed, even within the religion, people will disagree with what their holy book says. This is why Christian denominations keep splitting and why there are so many of them. There are 42,000 Christian denominations precisely because Christians can't agree on what the Bible says and fought each other. And in the past, when they held power, killed each other. And sometimes even today kill each other. There's no hate like Christian love, after all. And look how awful they are even to each other. But the reason they can't work out their differences with the Bible is because they can't meet and talk about it. They believe they are right and God approves of them and the others are heretics. And they just cast them out. Thus do churches split. For the reason there are 42,000 denominations of Christianity is over disagreement about what their supposedly divinely authored holy book says. Not so with atheists. They do not divide over differences. They debate and discuss. We know that's not true. You see, the atheist movement, the secular movement's crippled itself due to infighting over various issues. Even recently, one of the most respected members of the skeptic community, Meta, the self-declared friendly atheist, was lamenting the fact that several respectable atheists in the rationalist and skeptical community had written a book called The War on Science. And the book wasn't about how Christianity and religion held back science, or how the Trump administration had stripped away needed funding for science because of Christian nationalism. But instead, these once noble, once respected, once admirable atheist figures like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, and even Michael Shermer, had betrayed reason and secular values by going against the woke, by arguing against transgenderism. They denied trans people existed. They went against the gay rights movement. They went against various other modern progressive ideas. And this wasn't even the first time the self-declared skeptic movement broke apart, split up, divided into factions. Atheism Plus caused a schism in the atheist movement. And you see a lot of smaller schisms as well. The simple truth is, secularists are not as willing as they say to sit at a table and hash out their differences. They say they are. They're not. And it doesn't really matter that they don't believe that their ideas come from an all-powerful creator of the universe, or that their ideas have cosmic significance. What matters is they still hold them with as much conviction as the religious do, who do believe their ideas come from God and have cosmic significance. They refuse to let go. They refuse to negotiate. They refuse to compromise. They refuse to change their minds. Secularism doesn't have an answer to the infighting. What's more, its narrative was an oversimplistic one to begin with. While it's true that Christians have argued for centuries over things and that some will not listen to what others say and will not compromise on certain beliefs, at other times they do. And if you look at the Christian world today, ecumenism is much more common. And churches working with other churches that they disagree with on some issues is much more common than in the past. And you also see Christians perfectly willing to debate their differences with each other, while still accepting others as brothers or sisters in Christ. What's more, even that popular cobbler about how the reason we have 42,000 denominations is because a church splits over disagreement on how to interpret the Bible isn't actually true. It is true that some new denominations are formed by a church split based upon disagreement on how to interpret the Bible or various other Christian beliefs. But it is not true that the only reason we get a new denomination is because of a church split over disagreement on how to interpret the Bible. Please note, if you're a bigoted atheist psychopath, I've already said that, yes, there are churches that split over disagreement on how to interpret the Bible. or on theological issues. I have admitted that sometimes new denominations form due to church splits over disagreement on theology. But the problem with bigoted atheist psychopaths is that for some reason you have a zero-sum game in mind, where either all churches are formed through disagreement on the Bible and theology, or else no church is formed that way. And I'm telling you that some do break off due to disagreement on the Bible and theology, but not all. In fact, most new denominations of Christianity are not formed as a result of a church split. They are simply created by people who want to organize a church in a local area. This is especially common amongst evangelicals and Pentecostals. Often, evangelicals and Pentecostals will simply find each other and decide to set up a church, or someone decides to be a pastor, moves into an area and rents a space and simply begins preaching, or owns a store or something and begins using that as his church. And then other people are invited and you get one, or they grow out of small prayer meetings. And sometimes some of those 42,000 denominations consist of only one congregation, or two or three in a local area. And even if they grow from those small beginnings to a much larger denomination that spans an entire state in America, or an entire region, or perhaps all of America or the world, they still didn't begin from a church split. Of course, the typical bigoted atheist psychopath's response to that is, well, the people founding these churches were Christians, right? Well, if they were Christian, they would have had to belong to some denomination or other. The fact that they left that denomination to found this new church means that they weren't happy or satisfied with the denomination they were in. They must have disagreed with what it was teaching and how it interpreted the Bible, or else they would have just stayed a member of that denomination. They wouldn't have left to found a new one. That means that it's still a church split. It may not be a formal one or a legal one that goes to court, but it's still a church split as people are leaving a denomination they're not satisfied with to found a new church. And again, if you're a bigoted atheist psychopath, this is not a zero-sum game where either all are like that or none are like that. But I will admit that that does happen sometimes, where a small group of people are dissatisfied or don't agree with what their denomination teaches, so they leave to found a new one. Or an individual person does, as a pastor. But that doesn't mean that this is the case every single time. And the reality is, you don't have to belong to a specific denomination and leave it to found a new church because you disagree with what that denomination teaches. You can decide to found a new denomination with absolutely no criticism of the way the denomination you used to belong to understood the Bible. And this is something that bigoted atheist psychopaths never understood. Bigoted atheist psychopaths who still quote arguments from the new atheism and who still won't admit that they've made a religion out of what they think an atheist should be. They'll just make fun of me for calling atheism a religion. And when I point out that I said, made a religion out of what you think atheists should be is not the same thing as atheism itself being a religion, well, of course, call me a liar who called atheism a religion and denied calling it a religion. And I don't care anymore because you're bigoted atheist psychopaths who will never address the real point. But what you people don't understand, if you're bigoted atheist psychopaths, is that the arguments you learn from the atheist community largely came from the 19th century free thought movement. And when it comes to how they argue about how Christians think, it's often Anglican or Catholic from the 19th century that they're actually addressing. And it's not the way modern evangelical Protestants think. It's not the way Pentecostals think. And keep in mind, I am not an evangelical Protestant. I am not a Pentecostal. I'm simply pointing this out because it's the truth, and the typical atheist 42,000 denominations argument is complete rubbish. You see, most Christians don't actually think their denomination is the one true church, and all others are heretics damned to hellfire. The way evangelicals and Pentecostals view Christianity, there is only one true church, but that true church is the invisible body of all believers and is not contained within any single denomination. They actually see denominational churches as simply instruments being used by Jesus to help fulfill certain functions, like organizing and holding worship services, or organizing charity events, or for developing Bible study groups and things like that. Things where you would need an organizational structure in order to actually accomplish things, whereas a group of individuals with no central structure couldn't do that. But they still just see the denomination as nothing more than a mechanism to achieve that goal. They don't see the denomination as the one true church, with all others being false. And they also largely don't care what denomination you actually go to. It's not actually uncommon for evangelicals to float between denominations, not because they learn to disagree with what this denomination is teaching, so they're renouncing it and going to another one. More along the lines of, let's say you normally go to this evangelical church on 4th Street, but your friend who is also an evangelical Christian invited you to go to his church and you decide to visit it for a week. So you go to the 73rd Street Evangelical Church. The people at the 73rd Street may see you as a visitor because you're not a regular church attendee, but they still see you as just as Christian, and you can participate in all the events in exactly the same way. And if an evangelical moves, let's say he gets another job and he moves to another city, he'll often just look for a church in the area where he likes the people and he fits in with them, and that preaches the Bible, rather than looking at the denominational name. Many evangelical churches don't even advertise what denomination they belong to, if they belong to a denomination. A lot of them like to call themselves non-denominational these days. And that's because they don't think it matters. You don't have to belong to this one specific evangelical church in order to be an evangelical. And they will accept people from others. They basically judge it based upon if they teach the Bible, and if they like the people, and if the people are what they call spirit-filled, especially if they're Pentecostal. And evangelicals don't have the formal structure of theology that something like a Catholic would have, or even my own Church of Christ that I belong to. And I know that's weird if you've heard of the Church of Christ, because they're congregational and they don't have a central authority. So that's why if you go to one congregation in the Church of Christ, it can be very different than another, because the congregational nature of it makes it wildly different. In reality, the churches of Christ are consistent in their teachings. Congregationalism does not make them inconsistent. People just assume that they're inconsistent. But the churches of Christ actually have a very rigid theological system that's maintained through a shared literary network rather than a central denominational headquarter. But that's beside the point. The point being made here is evangelicals aren't so loose that they don't care at all what you teach. They do care. But what qualifies to them as the essentials about what you must get right and what you must get wrong? There's a core set of beliefs that generally evangelicals hold to, that you will preach and they will accept you. If you preach on other issues, they may disagree with you, but they will not see you as some heretic damned to hellfire, and they won't even necessarily leave your church. They may simply disagree with you on that point. In fact, it's very common for evangelicals or Pentecostals to say, I went to church. I heard Pastor John preach this sermon, and I disagreed with him. But he's still a faithful brother in Christ. He's still a servant of the Lord. They agree with most of what he says. They just disagree here or there. Which is another bizarre thing, because bigoted atheist psychopaths tell us that religious people are blind followers who aren't allowed to question their leaders. So whatever their leaders say, they just obey and believe. So they just shut their brain off and listen to their pastor who tells them what to think. That's not how it works in the real world. But the reason I'm talking about all this is, since evangelicals and Pentecostals don't put a lot of emphasis on denominations, and they see them as nothing but useful agencies to help the Christian cause rather than being the one true church, it's very easy for someone who is evangelical to found a new church denomination without feeling any antipathy or disagreement with any denomination he had previously visited, even if it's 9 or 10 that he used to belong to before at age 40 he decided to be a pastor. So the 42,000 denominations argument was always bogus to begin with. But therein lies the point. Secularism promised us an alternative to Christian infighting, which they claimed was heavy and severe. And Christian infighting isn't heavy and severe. Christians get along with each other far better than the secularists get along with each other. Secularism's selling point of being able to have dialogue and disagreement and debate while still being friends and using reason to resolve differences never materialized in the real world. The secular movement fell apart precisely because of infighting. Whereas Christianity is united even as new denominations are being created. At least it's more united than secularism. Even when you come up with things that have fundamental theological differences that do cause serious divides in Christianity, there is far less hostility toward each other in Christianity. And it doesn't matter that 500 years ago the Reformation happened and there were wars of religion. What matters is what we're doing right now. And the Reformation and the wars of religion were over more than just theological disagreements. The whole thing was more complicated. I'll do another video in the future about that. I've already done one in the past about it, but I'll do another one in the future about it as well. But the other things secularism promised weren't true either. For instance, they promised that they would teach us to be rational rather than religious, which is predicated on the understanding that religion is inherently irrational. But they don't teach reason. Hurling childish insults and bullying people, that's not rational. telling people that they're delusional for believing in a magical sky fairy, that's not rational. Calling God people's imaginary friend isn't rational. And it certainly isn't rational to say that people are delusional and they believe in a fictional God and God is just their imaginary friend, only to turn around and say, I am not making any claims. I just lack belief in a God. Therefore, I have no burden of proof. The sole burden of proof lies with the theist. You're the one making the insane claim that a fantasy creature is real. You alone have the burden of proof. It's obvious they're claiming that God doesn't exist. And it's obvious that they're promising us a utopia, like seen in Star Trek, where religion has died and reason has prevailed, and because we have embraced humanist principles instead of religious principles, the world is better. Well, we tried that, and it went insane. We now have people dyeing their hair blue, screaming at the top of their lungs over any perceived slight, over disagreements that you could have had yesterday but can't have today, while people are going to jail for hate speech. And when it was Christians going to jail for hate speech or for silently praying, the atheist movement denied it and said we had the Christian persecution complex. But now you have atheist comedians going to jail. And now it's a problem. Sam Harris was both right and wrong when he said that atheism offers nothing that would inspire us. He was wrong because he was basing that on defining atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God. And a lack of belief has no narrative, no story, nothing to inspire you. Atheism is not a lack of belief in a God. Atheism is a belief that there is no God. And if Sam Harris understood himself as an atheist as just someone who lacked belief in a God, he wouldn't have been able to join various atheist organizations that helped get his sham degree in neuroscience, and he wouldn't have been able to promote his book through the Edge Foundation and get grants to write it along with the others. In fact, the whole new atheism was AstroTurf. John Brockman, by the way, was the shared literary agent of all four horsemen of new atheism. It was actually orchestrated, which is why they used a lot of the same arguments. That, and they were just digging up the corpses of dead atheists to plagiarize their arguments. Most notably, Hitchens did this. He literally plagiarized certain pages from Chapman Cohen. But the very fact that Sam Harris wrote The End of Faith, Letter to a Christian Nation and the Moral Landscape, while belonging to various humanist organizations like the American Humanist Association, the National Secular Society. In the UK, that was Dawkins, sorry. More like the Council for Secular Humanism, which merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation to become the Center of Inquiry, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, American Atheists. The fact that he's able to join these groups, and the fact that these groups exist, and the fact that his books promote certain perspectives that people must believe if they have no religion. All of that undermines the idea that Sam Harris is just a man who lacks belief in a God. He claims God doesn't exist as a fact. He ridicules people as delusional who believe in God, and he pushes humanist values. In the modern world, humanism and atheism are largely synonymous. And the humanist narrative does exist. The idea that it has nothing is not true. It not only has this myth is used to inspire people and did inspire people. So he's wrong. The atheist movement had the humanist myth to inspire people. The idea that because there is no God, that we have no masters, that we can, to some degree, control our fate. Granted, Sam Harris doesn't believe in free will and is a determinist, but the point being, we are not slaves to some fictional God. We can take charge of our own lives. And we are glorious because we are star stuff. The very things that gave us the stars gave us us. And we are part of a grand, beautiful, wondrous cosmos that if we use reason and critical thinking, we can build a perfect utopian world where most, if not all, of our problems are solved through science and technology and reason. We'll have a progressive future where we're all free from the constraints of superstition and religion and hatred, and we'll unite as a common humanity and explore the stars. The problem with the humanist narrative isn't that it doesn't inspire us. The problem with the humanist narrative is that it's not true. It's not true that atheists just lack belief in a God and aren't making claims and have no burden of proof. They are claiming that God doesn't exist, and that's obvious. It's not true that you don't need God to give meaning to life. They say it is, but when you listen to them talk, it's obvious that they don't understand what people mean when they talk about meaning. They can say that your life can have meaning that you assign it, which is true to an extent, but philosophically there's a difference between an ultimate meaning and a meaning that we give something. Something can be personally meaningful to me that's not meaningful to you, for example. And if I assign meaning to something, I can revoke that meaning. The meaning is not inherent to the object that I am assigning the meaning to, even if that object is my own life. Any meaning I assign my own life is meaning that my life does not fundamentally have on its own. It is meaning that I gave it from outside. Meaning that this meaning that I give my life is not inherent to my life. The conclusion thereof would be that there is no inherent meaning. There is only assigned meaning. And when people talk about the meaning of life, and if their life even has meaning, they aren't talking about if they can assign their life meaning. Anyone can assign meaning to anything. They're talking about if their life has meaning inherently, and it can't under the secularist system. And no amount of saying you can give your own life meaning will change that fact. Just like no amount of telling us that the meaning of life is to enjoy life, to experience wonder, and to have pleasure is going to be fulfilling. So when people like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or Steven Pinker tell us that the meaning of our life is to have wonderful and pleasurable experiences, they are reducing life to a self-serving hedonism, to narcissism, which is ultimately unfulfilling to people. What's more, the way that progressives got rid of traditionalism by endlessly vilifying people who are conservative or traditional, by endlessly vilifying religion and religious people, will ultimately be used against other people who are themselves progressive if they are not progressive enough or the right sort of progressive. Progressivism assumes a better world is possible once we get rid of the retrogrades. And today's progressive can be tomorrow's retrograde if he doesn't move with the times. And you'll always have fractures and infighting on what exactly progress means. And beyond the idea that consent and pleasure and wonder are the only things we live for, personal gratification of physical desire, will always lead to greater conflict and cross purposes. And it will never lead to anything higher than a desire for base pleasures. The simple truth of the matter is the modern humanist view of the world is a failure. And the modern atheist movement is not a group of people who just lack belief in a God. They're secular humanists who assert as a fact that God doesn't exist and that we live in a material world. And you can't get around that. The reality of the world we live in makes it necessary for us to reach out to God. Of course, bigoted atheist psychopaths will say, well, what's the meaning of God then? They don't really seem to understand God as creator of everything else. But the very concept of meaning would have had to be created by God too. So God doesn't need meaning because meaning itself comes from God. It's like the pseudo-erythropro dilemma, where the atheist asks, is something moral because God says so? Or does God say so because it is moral? And the problem with this paradox is, if something is only moral because God says so, then it is arbitrary. But if God calls something moral because it is moral, then God cannot have absolute power, since what is and is not moral is decided outside of him. And they don't really seem to understand that this doesn't work as an argument, because there is no distinction between because God said so and because it is moral. Because what is itself comes from God. God is the source of existence. Therefore, what is moral is contingent on how God created the universe to begin with. So it's both. God just said so, and God is saying so because it's the way the universe works. Because God created the universe. It all comes from him. Meaning comes from God. God does not have meaning. Just as Aquinas said, God has no potential, using the old philosophical terms. God cannot change. God is an absolute. And everything else is contingent on God and came out of God, including the concept of meaning. And this is the point. Everything in the secular movement is a lie. Take deconversion from religion. This word didn't exist historically. It was made up sometime in the early 2000s. And it was invented so that atheists could highlight the idea that being an atheist is the opposite of being religious. So the process of becoming an atheist is the opposite of becoming religious. People spoke about converting to a religion. So what happens when you leave religion and become an atheist? Well, you go through the opposite process of conversion. You deconvert. The problem with deconversion as a word, though, is that to convert doesn't even mean to become religious. To convert means to change. So even though atheists aren't religious, by definition, they're just the opposite of being religious. They still didn't deconvert from religion to become an atheist. They converted to atheism. They needed to prop up the idea that atheism is the opposite of religion by inventing the word deconversion. But it's still a nonsensical word. And I'm saying this with a full knowledge that Scarlet the Atheist made fun of me for saying that before. After all, real institutions use the word deconversion, and that makes it a real word. Scarlet the Atheist didn't make fun of Sam Harris, though. And Sam Harris said the word atheist shouldn't exist. So did Richard Dawkins. Atheists, of course, play by double standards. When an atheist says the word atheist shouldn't exist because we don't have a word for people who lack belief in unicorns, no one's called an a-unicornist. That's brilliant. But when I say deconversion's a silly made-up nonsense word, I'm being ridiculous because real institutions use the word. Don't address the argument, atheists. You're psychopaths. You don't have to. You can just rely on your childish insults. But deconversion is a silly made-up nonsense word. It doesn't make sense. How do you de-change? If I change my clothes and then change back into the same outfit, I'm still changing both times. I'm not de-changing. It's silly. But then again, so is framing atheism as the opposite of religion. We do. Our whole culture does this. We talk about the conflict between atheism and religion as if they're two separate camps. But atheism is not the opposite of religion. Atheism is the opposite of theism. And religion and theism don't mean the same thing. And atheist arguments that say that religion at least requires a belief in a god are contradictory, since they'll also call communism a form of religion. And the communists were atheists. In fact, the communists were the same sort of atheists that the modern new atheists were. They were. None of the communists believe something different than the humanist values that are held by the modern atheists. You can even go to the Marxist archives online and read about Marxist humanism, or find out how John Dewey, the founder of the American Humanist Association and principal architect behind the Humanist Manifesto, the first one from 1933, he praised the Soviet Union as a perfect model of a humanist society. The Soviet Union was recognized as an atheistic, humanistic society in the past. And now it's somehow not. Now it's religion. Which begs the question, why is humanism not a religion? Is it just because it's atheistic? The truth is, humanism is a religion. And the modern atheist movement is just secular humanism being promoted without being honest about what it's doing. The modern new atheist movement was itself a religious movement that promoted secular humanism. But feel free, atheists, to misrepresent my argument and say I said, atheism is a religion, and then make fun of me for not knowing the definition of atheism is a lack of belief in a God. And if I tell you, like I'm about to now, that my real argument is that secular humanism is a religion, and that the modern new atheism just pushed secular humanism, don't forget that I called atheism a religion and then denied calling atheism a religion and laugh your heads off. Don't address the fact that I'm calling secular humanism a religion. Just insist I called atheism a religion and I'm a liar who denied calling atheism a religion after calling it a religion. Make fun of me, atheists. It's what bigoted atheist psychopaths do. I don't expect better from you. But that's why you failed. You don't address the real arguments. You address straw men. Every time atheists talk about Jesus being a failed apocalyptic prophet and predicted the end times and the second coming would happen in the lifetime of the disciples, without addressing the fact that the Olivet discourse that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke was not actually about the end times and the second coming. It was about the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. And by the way, end of the age doesn't mean the end of the age we're in. It means the end of the age they were in. And that what Jesus was actually talking about wasn't his second coming. It was actually him being revealed to the world as the Messiah and him defeating their enemies and building his kingdom. That's what the Olivet Discourse is actually about. It's not about the end times and the second coming. It's about the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, Jesus being revealed to be the Messiah, Jesus conquering his enemies, and Jesus establishing his kingdom. And all of those things happened within the lifetime of the disciples. Of course, you may say the last one didn't. After all, Jesus hasn't built his kingdom. He's not ruling from Jerusalem. Obviously, the kingdom's not here, guys. It's going to come at the second coming, proving it's a false prophecy. The idea that the kingdom won't be built until the second coming is an idea that came largely from the Anabaptists and is largely promoted now by dispensationalists in the 19th century. Throughout the entirety of church history, Christians have known that the kingdom is the church. Jesus isn't coming back to earth to reign for 1,000 years, building a physical kingdom. The kingdom is already here. It's the church. Jesus will return a second time, but that's on Judgment Day. And the disciples, when they asked, when is the sign of thy coming and when shall be the end of the age? They weren't asking when they said thy coming about his second coming. They were asking when he would be revealed as the Messiah. He was revealed as the Messiah on Palm Sunday. Hosanna, Hosanna. He had his victory on the cross over death after his resurrection. And Pentecost established the church, all within one generation. And the church remains the kingdom of Christ to this day. When Christ returns, it will be on Judgment Day. It will not be to establish a kingdom and reign for 1,000 years. It will be on Judgment Day. But feel free to say mine's an ad hoc argument and that yours is the plain reading of the text. You people are so stupid you don't even know that you're getting this ultimately from Robert Ingersoll. But you are. Just like I read the Bible like any other book comes from Ingersoll. None of the new atheist arguments were really new or original, except maybe the communism was really a religion crap. But I bet they plagiarized that from someone too, just a later person. John Dewey did the religious zeal in the communists, so it might be based on something Dewey said. But the simple truth is, the idea that humanity can reshape itself around progressive values, that men can be women, that we can do whatever we want to seek pleasure, and that seeking pleasure is the highest thing that we can do, and that we'll have this wonderful world of reason once we've gotten rid of God and conservative traditional values. It's led to a wrecked society. It has not led to a glorious society of wonder and scientific achievement and peace and prosperity. In fact, we're on the verge of economic collapse. Governments have turned tyrannical. And ultimately, authoritarian control is all they have left. Just like they did when they took over the Soviet Union, which was an officially atheist government run on secular principles. That was also hostile to Christianity, just like Western governments are. It always ends the same way. And revival always happens. Because one of the biggest lies that the secularist movement told was this idea that religion had been strong in society until the new atheism came, and that they came along shining the light of reason on it, and it broke down immediately after. The new atheists weren't new. The same thing that they did in the early 21st century had been done in the late 19th century by people like Charles Bradlaugh, by Anne Besant before she became an occultist, by Carl Pearson, by George Jacob Holyoake, and by others, like Joseph McCabe. They predicted the death of Christianity at the end of the 19th century. And they predicted it again in the 1920s. And revival always happened. They predicted the death of Christianity during the 1930s and 40s, and after the Second World War, there was a revival. There's always a revival. There was a revival in the 1970s. Not as big, but there was one. Christianity wasn't some constantly strong force until the new atheism came along and began eroding it. It has always faded and come back. And that's a lesson of history that the secularist religion fails to grasp. Because another big lie that they tell is that we're not religious. Secularism is a religion. And please note, I said secularism is a religion. I didn't say atheism is a religion. But feel free, if you're a bigoted atheist psychopath, to lie about what I said and say I said atheism is a religion, and then mock me for it. And then mock me for saying I'm not saying atheism is a religion by saying, you called atheism a religion, Make fun of me, atheists. Make fun of me. You've lost. You have to lose. Because after a small dose of progressivism, everyone sees what a wreck you make of the world, and your ideas and principles never work. Secularism never works. It breeds tyranny and corruption and madness. And it never works. I don't have much else to say now. My voice is giving out. So I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you. God bless. And goodbye.